Now, being Christmas, it's not all fruit pies, fruit mince pies and glazed ham. There can be conflicts and arguments that arise. So how can you do that effectively? How can you do that healthily? We've brought in a psychologist to help. James Le Lievre is from North Brisbane Psychologists and can hopefully give us some tips. Hello, James.
Ashwin, thanks for having me on the program.
It's good to have you with some advice on this subject. But before we get to the tips, what are the benefits of arguing?
It's an interesting thing. Everyone talks about a discussion and we immediately assume it's going to be an argument. So I like to use the word that we should be free to express ourselves. So it's really, really important to express what's on our mind, what we think, what we feel, but it doesn't have to be an argument.
What happens if we don't express ourselves?
We become a little withdrawn, and that's not how we want to be. I think when we express ourselves, we become known to those around us, and that's the best way for us to connect.
So how do we express ourselves in a way that doesn't necessarily become an argument?
The key here is not assuming that I have some sort of knowledge of absolute truth. So most of the time when we're talking about beliefs and experience, most of the time. So we can express it talking about myself. So we use what's called I language. So, we say, this is what I think, what I feel, these are my needs, etc. That sort of language. If we do that, then we're much less likely to upset people and get a reaction from others.
On the flip side, what are common mistakes that you notice people making in an argument?
The classic mistakes, Ashwin, is when people assume objectivity. So they believe that maybe they've been supporting some view, some idea for some time, and they think it's an absolute truth. And even though they may have many, many good points, they're sort of not realising that their own experience, their life world, everything they bring to this discussion is very personal, and they don't realise how much other people have a different view.
Do you think there's a deeper reason for why humans believe in absolute truth? Maybe from an evolutionary point of view, we had to believe that we knew the answer. We had to have some security in this belief. It couldn't just be some one belief amongst many. Where do you think this absolute truth notion comes from?
You've really absolutely got me stumped there.
Yeah.
I really don't know why. I can only say that the less if our life involves the cooperation of others, more so like in a village environment, we're going to be thinking about other people much more, and we're going to have a much greater knowledge of mind of the other people. But I think as we become more isolated, particularly in the West, it's very easy to live for yourself, by yourself, etc., and not have to consider the thoughts and experiences of other people. That's my guess.
Okay, that's a nice theory of where this rigidity can come from. But we're in the middle of an argument now. Things are getting heated. What should we do in that situation?
Look, I think what's behind most arguments is this dire need to be acknowledged. To just want someone else to know what we're thinking and feeling and to accept that. We don't have to agree, but if we can just accept. So my suggestion to anyone is to just acknowledge the points of view of the other person without having to agree.
Have you got some language around, in case you've never acknowledged anyone's point of view before, what's some words that you'd use?
So we'd say, okay, so we'd summarise. We'd say it sounds like you believe that, this case, maybe Australian cricket team is going to win some next ODI or something like that. And you'd summarise that by saying, okay, so it sounds like you've got a strong view around that, and I can understand it's important to you.
Do people ever think you're using acknowledgement as a tactic, and what's a way around that?
Well, if someone thinks that's a tactic, I'd say they're free to think whatever they like. We can't stop people from thinking things.
But I think part of it is also just genuinely feeling the need to listen and respond, not just using those as words, isn't it? Just actually feeling that.
It's a very good point. Just because we say things doesn't mean we feel those things. Yes. I think if we make it a habit, it's likely that we'll grow into that habit. So what I would suggest to anyone, no matter how mechanical it might feel, just see what you can do in that space by summarising the views of others, and, who knows, you might start to actually empathise with that person.
You've touched on this already. It's the importance of knowing your role in the conflict, which might be hurtful to your ego. But can you talk about the importance of that?
Can you
just knowing you're part of the problem. When you go into an argument, you might think, I want to blame you for the problem, but I might have a role in the way I've behaved and done. How important is knowing that and reflecting on it?
Yeah, and how easy is it for people to acknowledge their own role in a conflict? Very, very challenging. It's going to come back to the same thing, and this is the good news. It's really quite theoretically, it's very simple to overcome all these issues. Practically, it's incredibly difficult. But I keep coming back to the same point, that we need to express what I think, what I feel. This is what I've noticed happening. And then we can say to the other, what have you seen happening? What do you think's going on here?
Is this a particularly difficult time for conflicts based on your experience talking to people?
Absolutely. It is by far and away the most challenging time of the year for most people. So coming back into contact with family now, for most people, it's a fantastic time of the year, and I mean that's a wonderful thing, but not for everyone. Some people do come from high conflict families, and so many people will choose not to visit their families today. They'll stay away, which is really quite sad. If we can find a way to manage the family and be with the family, it's much, much better than being absent.
Tell us some tips to be with the family that you might have some tension with.
There's really a core thing here. I'm glad you asked me that question. Because it's so important for us to feel acknowledged, to really feel understood, and if we're going into a family context where that may not be the case, the best thing we can do to prepare ourselves is think of someone in the back of my mind somewhere, a friend, a relative, an aunt or an uncle, someone who has always been acknowledging. And I think of that person, I think of being with that person. And so when I go into the family, I don't need to be acknowledged by the immediate people in front of me. I've got in the back of my mind that if the people in front of me don't accept me or understand me, at least I've got someone somewhere else who does.
Is there any value in keeping the conversation superficial to avoid conflicts?
It's a very old thing. It's traditionally there were tips, to stay out of conflict with people. I can remember when I was very young and dating a girl, and I went to visit her family, and very quickly a controversial topic came up, and the father gave me a tip when I was exiting, and he said, "I can give you a tip to never talk about sex, politics, and religion."
Yeah.
And they are very, very sensible tips.
Are they, when you talk to people, patients or clients in your practice, do you notice a pattern in the main things that people argue about? If it's not that, are there more personal things that get in between people? Regrets and annoyances from childhood, things like that?
Probably the most contentious thing that I see in people's lives is when they're talking about parenting. It really is a tough one, because you can have a couple that get on very well for many years. All of a sudden, a child comes into the picture and they've got a different view on parenting. So conflict is it's going to happen.
What are the main things parents disagree about?
How to parent the child. So whether we should use rewards, whether we should use consequences, whether we should just talk and be rational and hope that logic somehow affects the behaviour of the child.
Is there any research on how to parent? So you can go to the neutral umpire when you consider an authoritarian style or a talk-based style. Is there any research on good parenting that people are open to?
Mountains and mountains and mountains of research on every topic you can possibly imagine, and everyone has a different view on that. It's probably a little bit of a wormhole to go down.
No, okay. But just it's nice to have a third umpire sometimes in your conflicts. How can we use active listening in our arguments?
Again, I'd say, how do we use active listening in our discussions? So now this is something I didn't mention before. An argument is something where everyone's very familiar with because we learn it at school. So in debating, you have two teams and you have a chairperson. We see it in Parliament, we see it in the law courts. So it's always this situation where you've got two opposing teams and a third person who's the judge or the chairperson. And the judge or chairperson will, in most cases, declare who's the winner and who's the loser. And that's the key. Whenever there's an argument, there's always a loser. So we can avoid the whole thing by simply expressing our views, agreeing to differ, and then no one's a loser.
That's a very good point. Almost saying to the person, you intend to find common ground. That's exactly the purpose of this discussion.
Oh, that's by far the best thing to do. So yeah. I can really understand this point you're saying here. I can identify with that. I really relate to that. We can just gloss over the part we don't relate to and hang on to and express the part we do relate to.
You're listening to James Le Lievre, North Brisbane psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists, talking to us about how we can argue effectively and ultimately repair broken relationships if it gets to that point. Before it gets to that point, though, how do we avoid holding on to arguments and some of the nasty things that people may have said to us in the past?
There's a really good philosophy to not take things personally, to remember that most people, when they're talking about, even when we're talking to us or about us, when someone gets heated, when someone gets angry, they're most likely being triggered. something from the past is coming up. They're getting very, very uncomfortable. And when that happens, people tend to go into autopilot. It's no longer a personal thing about you. It's something coming from within themselves. So they're reacting to all sorts of things that might have happened in the past. And so it becomes a very patterned response.
Yes. Someone has texted in a common piece of language. Alan has messaged a common piece of language people use in argument, and that is they reckon. The other word is people think, people say. Alan writes, argument is the art of debate. If you want to raise a point with they reckon, then you need to say who they are. What are your sources? Things are not necessarily true just because they reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very good thing to do if you really want to get to a technical solution, or if there is some way of finding an objective truth. Let's say you're talking about how many runs were scored in the latest cricket match. Obviously, there is an answer to that. And so acknowledging sources or inquiring about sources is a very, very simple and diplomatic way to go about that.
Some people get into philosophy and looking for logical biases, logical errors in the person's argument. Is that a tactic, or does that not solve the problem? Because yes, you might win the argument, but you didn't find the common ground that will ultimately improve the relationship.
There's just on this point of, if we are trying to influence a person, which is generally what happens when we've got a belief or an idea we're trying to influence the other, there is another approach altogether, and that's a Socratic questioning approach. And it's basically, that's morphed into what we now call active listening. So you can use this questioning approach, getting into the mind of the other. So dropping what's in our head, getting into the mind of the other and navigating through their thoughts and see if we can get them to stumble on their own thoughts. Now, if they do stumble, then we can say, hey, can I suggest something new or something different here? If they don't stumble, we should accept that they're comfortable with their knowledge.
That's a very interesting point. Socrates, people used to get really annoyed with him in the marketplace, but it works, doesn't it, that approach?
Absolutely.
Just takes some practice. When is it time to walk away from a relationship that's filled with arguments?
The time to walk away from an argument is going to be when a person is not able to settle, to calm down, to find some sort of logic or rationale or be sensible in the conversation. Some people find it very, very difficult to calm themselves down, and that's a really key thing. When we're emotionally triggered and we become, the adrenaline comes into the body, most people, if not all people, find it very difficult to be logical. So if someone's very heightened, very much, they've been triggered and there's adrenaline in their system, we should at the very least pause the discussion for a later time.
And don't laugh. Don't do those things that make it worse.
That's definitely going to make things worse.
Yeah.
We don't want to be a smart aleck if someone's really passionate about what they're saying.
What are some tips to repair a broken relationship?
That's a very important question. I think being earnest here is and trying to let go of our ego, which you mentioned before, is going to be a big thing. We need to be able to come into a person and essentially apologise and say, hey, look, I'm really sorry things didn't go well between us, at some previous time. Maybe I was heated, maybe you were heated, but I'd really like to maybe go over anything that was important to you. I'd like to listen again. James Le Lievre is a psychologist at North Brisbane Psychologists. Any last message you'd like to leave with us on this topic, James? Yeah, I'd like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and make sure that, although we don't have to win an argument or engage in trying to influence other people, I really hope everyone feels confident to express how they think and feel about things without expecting too much on the other end. Thank you for coming in, James. You're welcome.